There's a common way this idea gets presented online, a list of 5 or 10 purchases you're told are secretly keeping you poor. That framing turns personal finance into moral judgment, and it rarely holds up once you actually run the math. The more useful version isn't a list of banned purchases at all. It's one simple question you can apply to any purchase, big or small. In this video, we're breaking down what that question is, the real math behind it, where it genuinely doesn't apply, and how to use it without turning every purchase into a guilt trip. Let's start with the question itself. Here's the actual rule, and it's simpler than any listicle version of it. Before making a purchase of real size, for this video, we're using $1,000 as the example threshold, though. The principle scales up or down. Ask yourself one specific question, not, "Can I afford this?" which almost always gets answered yes for a $1,000 purchase on a stable income. Instead, ask, what else could this same $1,000 become if I didn't spend it here? That single reframe shifts the comparison away from your bank balance today and toward every other version of your future this money could have quietly built instead. It's not a rule about restriction. It's a rule about actually seeing the full menu of options before picking one. Here's why this reframe matters so much. When you look at a $1,000 purchase and just ask whether you can afford it, you're comparing it against your current bank balance, a static number that doesn't account for what that money would have otherwise done over time. But money that isn't spent doesn't just sit there doing nothing if it's invested instead. It grows. And the true cost of any purchase isn't really the number on the price tag. It's the number on the price tag plus everything that money would have, compounded into if it had been invested instead. Economists call this opportunity cost, and it's one of the most consistently underweighted concepts in everyday spending decisions, because the alternative future you're giving up is invisible in a way the price tag never is. This is also why two people with identical purchase histories can end up in very different financial positions over time, not because one of them broke some rule, but because one of them was implicitly running this comparison and the other genuinely never was. Let's actually run the numbers, because this is where the rule stops being abstract. $1,000 invested and left alone to grow at a historically reasonable average market return can meaningfully more than double over roughly a decade, and grow several times over across 2 or 3 decades purely through compounding, no additional contributions required. This doesn't mean a single $1,000 purchase will bankrupt anyone. One purchase on its own genuinely won't. But the real cost most people miss isn't a single purchase. It's the pattern of repeatedly treating each individual $1,000 decision as isolated, when in reality, the habit of consistently choosing to spend instead of invest at this size, repeated across years, is what actually determines the size of the gap between two people with identical incomes, making different decisions at the exact same size threshold over and over again. Small individual amounts rarely feel consequential in the moment they're spent, which is exactly why the pattern is so easy to miss until years of it have already accumulated. This is important to say clearly. This rule was never designed to talk anyone out of every $1,000 purchase, and treating it that way misses the actual point entirely. The question, what else could this become, isn't meant to produce a guilty no every single time. Sometimes the honest answer is that the purchase is genuinely worth more to your life right now than the alternative future version of that money, and that's a completely legitimate answer. The value of the question isn't in always choosing to invest instead. It's in actually making the comparison consciously, instead of defaulting to the purchase without ever considering what else that money represents. A framework that produces the same answer every single time isn't actually a decision-making tool. It's just a rule against spending, and that's not what this is. A useful decision-making tool should sometimes produce a yes and sometimes produce a no, depending on the actual situation. That variability is a feature of it working correctly, not a flaw. And here's where this rule genuinely doesn't apply, because pretending it's universal would make this less credible, not more. If you're already meeting your savings and investment goals consistently, applying this question to every single purchase on top of that is more likely to create anxiety than value. The rule is most useful for people who haven't yet built the habit of considering the trade-off at all, not for people already doing it. It also matters less at very high income levels, where a $1,000 purchase represents a meaningfully smaller portion of someone's overall financial picture than it does for someone earning significantly less. And it doesn't apply well to necessities. The framing works for discretionary decisions, not for essential costs, where the real question isn't really, what else could this become, but simply, how do I cover this? The rule is a tool for a specific kind of decision, not a lens for every dollar that moves through your life. Applying a discretionary spending framework to essential costs doesn't make someone more disciplined, it just makes an already stressful category of spending feel worse without actually changing anything useful about the decision. Here's where people trying to apply this get it wrong. Mistake 1. Using it to create guilt around every single purchase, including ones that were never the actual problem, which usually leads to abandoning the habit entirely out of sheer decision fatigue. Mistake 2. Running the math once on a hypothetical example and never actually applying it to a real purchase decision in the moment it matters. Mistake 3. Forgetting that the comparison should be to genuinely realistic alternatives, not an idealized version where every dollar not spent gets invested perfectly and never touched. Real life involves emergencies, other goals, and legitimate spending, and the comparison should reflect that instead of an unrealistic hypothetical. A framework built on an unrealistic comparison tends to get abandoned quickly, precisely because it stops matching anyone's actual lived experience. Here's how to actually apply this in practice. First, set your own threshold. It doesn't have to be exactly $1,000. Pick a number that represents a purchase size where you currently make decisions without much real thought. Second, before that kind of purchase, actually ask the question out loud or in writing. What else could this become? Not as a moral test, just as genuine information. Third, run a rough version of the math, even a simple estimate of what that amount could grow to over 10 or 20 years. So the alternative isn't abstract, it's an actual number sitting next to the actual price tag. Fourth, make the decision with both numbers in front of you and trust that a conscious yes is just as valid, an outcome as a conscious no. The goal was never a specific answer. It was always visibility. Visibility on its own tends to change behavior more reliably than guilt ever does, which is really the entire premise this rule is built on. So to bring it together, the real version of this rule isn't a list of banned purchases, it's one reframing question. What else could this money become? The true cost of any purchase includes the opportunity cost of what that money would have compounded into if invested instead, and running that math turns an abstract feeling into an actual comparison. This doesn't mean the answer should always be no, it means the decision should actually be conscious instead of automatic. And it doesn't apply the same way to everyone. It's a tool for building awareness in exactly the moments where awareness has been missing, not a universal law to apply anxiously to every transaction in your life. Used well, it's one of the simpler mental tools in personal finance, not because the math is complicated, but because remembering to actually ask the question is the part that takes practice. I'm Zyra, a research presenter, not a licensed financial advisor. This video reflects general behavioral and financial concepts around opportunity cost, not personalized financial advice, and what counts as a meaningful purchase threshold. Varies significantly based on your own income, goals, and circumstances. For guidance specific to your actual financial situation, a licensed financial advisor is always the better resource than any general video, including this one. If you want to actually try this the next time you're about to make a purchase around your own threshold, just ask the question before you decide. You don't need a spreadsheet, just genuine consideration. Drop a comment with what threshold you'd actually use for yourself. Thanks for watching, subscribe my channel, and I'll see you in the next one.